picking up in your book, if you have the Haggadah, I want to backtrack for just a second before we go forward. I wanted to point out on page 19 where it has the order of the Seder, where it goes through the 15 steps, the Kadesh, Rachatz, Karpas, Yachatz, Magid, Raksa, Motzi, Matzah, Maror, Korech, Shulchan Orech, Safun, Barach, Hallel, Nirtzah. If you'll notice in the Art Scroll version, they've actually put in bold print the translation, so that if you're not sure what those words mean, sometimes you see those in a Haggadah, and you kind of recognize what you're supposed to be doing in that step, but maybe you're not sure what that exact word is. That's what I like about the Art Scroll, is they're really good to give the scripture references or to translate for you. And so in the bold there, in the little pink steps beside, because they'll have the Hebrew, of course, on the right and the English transliteration on the left, but they have put in bold what the actual translation of that Hebrew word is. So Kadesh, we all know that, holiness or sanctification. Urchatz is a form of rachatz, which is washing. And you'll see that one twice. You'll see another form of it in raksa. Raksa, that was hard. You've got way down in your throat, and then you've got to come up with a sadi on top of that. It's just another word form of rachatz, which is going to be washing. But then the karpas is a vegetable. Yachatz, it means to not break so much, not a bad translation, but it's more accurately, it means to divide. So if you maybe want to pencil that in there, divide is probably more descriptive of yachatz. In fact, if you tried to Google translate that, it might not even pop that word up, as it might think you're trying to spell a proper name. So that helps a little bit in terms of helping you kind of visualize what is happening with the matzah boards, if you're using the boards. Then Magid is telling. We talked about, Har Megiddo or Armageddon. It's the mountain of telling. So narration is a great translation of that. There's the washing again. Motzi, you do that all the time when you do the hamotzi over your bread. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So who brings forth? It's one of the blessings, except when you're making your blessings during the week of Chag Hamatzah, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, instead of saying Hamotzi lechem min haaretz like you normally do, you're going to substitute matzah for lechem, because lechem implies, not always, but it implies leavened bread. And so you say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi matzah min haaretz. Hamotzi matzah. It's kind of got a ring to it. It's kind of fun. During that week, if you're eating, and you don't have to make that blessing, by the way. If you're not eating bread, don't make a bread blessing. If there's not bread on the plate, don't make a bread blessing. There's other blessings that you can make, and you can learn those if you want, but it would be considered an empty blessing because you're blessing something that's not there. Like if you wanted, if you had a vegetarian meal, you would say, Bore priha adama, who brings forth the fruit of the earth. Or if you were eating fruit salad, min ha, Bore priha etz, for the fruit of the tree. There's a blessing like for everything. If you're not really sure, like I don't even know, I just know there's not bread on here, so I don't want to make a bread blessing. There's an all-purpose one I can show you for that, which is kind of off the topic of here, but just, your blessings for your bread are going to be a little bit different on this night, and they're going to be a little bit different during this week. And that's just etiquette. That's just something you can kind of check off over in the etiquette column. Like, you don't make a blessing on something that's not there. Just like you wouldn't say hello to somebody who wasn't standing at your door. They're not there. So don't say hello. If the bread's not there, don't bless the bread that's not there. Maror is truly the bitter herbs. And we can hear that in the message to Smyrna, because it actually passed into the Greek as well. So the Hebrew and Greek, they share the same sound for maror, bitter herbs. Korech, they have it translated here as sandwich. And that probably would pop up if you did a Google Translate on it. But the actual meaning of it is binding together. And so when you bind bread and stuff together, that's a sandwich in English. So not a bad translation. The Shulchan Orech, that's an accurate translation. Shulchan is a table. Orech is the way that it's set out or that it's prepared. Safun is a word you should know from our studies. When we did the angels of the four winds, and we talked about how the angel of the north wind is a little bit special, that it's identified with the hiddenness of Messiah. And so you can see that reflected here when we eat the afikomen, which has been hidden. It's safun. That step is safun, which means hidden, but it also means north. So the rabbis say Messiah is hidden in the north. So something we have to kind of go behind them and learn. They kind of know Messiah is hidden in the north. And so clearly this afikomen has some connection from, bygone times with the Messiah. And remember, what was the saying? The north wind was left incomplete. Let him who says he is God come and complete it. And then we saw Yeshua doing exactly that on the Sea of Galilee, which kind of wowed the disciples, because that was the understanding. Only God would have the power to complete the north wind, to control it, to discipline it, and then Yeshua speaks to it. Barech, it's just like Baruch, the blessings. And then Hallel, you know what a Hallel is. It's a song of praise, and it's specific ones. And then Nirtza, you can hear Rotze or Ratzah. Ratzah is going to be the Shoresh, and it means to want something, to desire something, to want something. In this form, it means to accept it. So does he want this, this act of obedience on our part? And so we're asking him to desire it, to accept it. And with that acceptance, by the way, would you please speedily send Messiah to us? Kind of goes along with the acceptance. So I thought that it explains it over here, but it's not as, I think, as specific as what we saw on this page. And I did want to point that out before we moved on. All right, so Kadesh is where we stopped last week. And I did point out how if it does fall on an Erev Shabbat, then there's in the shaded pink extra things that we would do. And we did talk about Ephesus being permitted. So now let me share my screen and we'll try to get back on that track. Okay, and then we talked about why we lean. We even had a discussion on why do we lean to the left so we won't choke, I think was the conclusion on that. All right, which brings us to the second step. And there's two washings of the hands in a typical Seder. You're going to wash the hands. You're going to wash them a couple of times here. And so as you're doing that, there's different opinions. And again, it goes back to Min Chag. And And remember, minchag means custom. And so you're going to have different customs in different cultures of Judaism. European Jews are going to be a little bit different, maybe than Spanish Jews. Spanish Jews or Portuguese Jews, they're going to be different than, say, Mizrahi Jews, Middle Eastern Jews, possibly Mizrahi Jews in Northern Africa, like places like Morocco or Tunisia. They might be a little bit different from Iraq and Iran. So from community to community, you might have different opinions on how it should be done. But we're not talking about a commandment in the Bible. We're talking about a minchag. How did this community decide to do it so that we're all doing the same thing? So that you don't have, different tables with, like Paul described, everybody just goes ahead and does their own thing. We're not supposed to do that at a Passover Seder. Everybody should be on the same step. And Paul was even clear about that to the Corinthians, and they weren't, a typical Jewish community, but he still had that expectation of them. Don't you dare go ahead and jump ahead just because you've got all the wine and the food you want and leave people behind. Everybody should be on the same step. You don't go ahead and eat, or you don't rush through it, leaving other people behind. That's why you follow the steps, because you're a people tonight. So depending on your community, and sometimes depending on space, if you're doing a community Seder, if you've noticed, if you've done a community Seder, or even at your own table, it can get really crowded with all the things that you need on the table. So in some places, it might be that the head of the household is the only one who will do the washing of the hands at this point. It might be the everybody there, everybody at the table will do the washing of hands. And it's not to get your hands clean, by the way. It's just part of the step here. And they actually make little cups for this special little kind of mini hand washing. You're not going to all jump up and traipse over to the kitchen sink and use the double-sided pitcher at this point. If you have one, it can be something very low key. And so it might be, just a small pitcher at the table with a small bowl to catch the water. Or it might be the same bowls that you're going to do the other hand washing. It's totally up to you how you do that, or even if you do that. Like I say, if you've got newbies, there's going to be certain things in here you're probably not going to do. They're just trying to find Yeshua. And if you need to help them do that the first few years, just help them find Yeshua. But then as they go through, they can acquire more. Right? So especially with the washing of the hands, most people they kind of, get the little alert button when they see the washing of the hands, because Yeshua had a conversation with the Pharisees about washing hands. And it's kind of like you completely missed the whole point of the conversation. And now it's got this, thing about any washing of hands has got to be bad. No, it's not. And Yeshua, it doesn't say that Yeshua didn't wash his hands. It says his disciples didn't. And so there was some correction in there that Yeshua gave, but I don't think it had anything to do with whether they wanted to wash their hands or not. It was a different topic. So if you can help explain at some point, the symbolism of the washing of the hands, there's an open opportunity right there. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, purify your hearts, you double-minded. You definitely don't want to be double-minded going into the Passover Seder, because even though it's fun for the kids, there are very serious, heavy apocalyptic elements to it. And some of it's so understated that the kids won't pick up on it, but you'll know about it. Like the cup of Elijah is a cup of wrath that we're reading about in Revelation. When we get to these rabbis having the discussion, that's a heavy discussion, and you definitely don't want to take a 6-year-old to that level of understanding, but the adults at the table should know what that means. Okay, and then next, here we go, karpas, which is going to be your vegetable, and it can be something as simple as a little piece of parsley, something green. Remember, the green reminds you that Passover is always going to fall in the spring, that it's not going to move around through the year like a strictly solar calendar. You'll want to boil some salt and some water prior to the Seder, give it time to cool, and then maybe just have it in little dishes scattered around the table. And that's just a simple element. You know, you can dunk your parsley in the salt water, and the blessing that you make is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri ha'adama, which is who creates the fruits of the earth, or who brings forth the fruits of the earth. And again, it's just a small piece that you need to do right there, which takes us to yachatz, which, remember, it can mean breaking, but it's more specifically dividing. And this is where you'll pick up your matzah boards, or maybe you have found soft matzah. Some people like to make their own, as long as you get it in that oven really fast so that it doesn't have time to rise, you're fine. But you can use a big napkin if you don't have what's called a matzah tash. You can buy a matzah tash that's really fancy and embroidered and beautiful, and it's nice to have your own stuff each year to celebrate. It's called beautifying the mitzvah, making the mitzvah beautiful. As you obey it, you're trying to beautify it. And so whether you're using a big napkin where you can stick 3 matzah boards in those little between the folds, that's the easy thing to do. If you have a matzah tash, it'll already have the folds, and then you just stick your 3 boards in there prior to the Seder when you're setting your table. But you're going to reach in there, you're going to take that middle piece of matzah, and you're going to divide it. And when you divide it like that, you're going to take the larger of those 2 pieces and have you another napkin. It could be a linen napkin. Some people like to use the linen napkins because they understand the symbolism of what's happening. Because remember, it represents something. It represents someone. And so you even have that little bit of symbolism in the Gospels where it talks about the napkins which that's King James, but the linen fabric that went around Yeshua's head, that it being folded there and left in the grave. So whether you want to use a paper napkin or whether you want to use linen because of the symbolism of the burial in the linen, doesn't matter. Just wrap it up. And the larger piece there, that's going to be called your afikomen, which means dessert. It's a Greek word. It means dessert. And again, there's discussions in workbook 6 about some of these things that people get on the internet and have a big time challenging it and saying, this is pagan, this is Greek, this is a Greek drinking party, this has no business in here. We go back and we address those things. We just go back in the sources and say, where did this come from? So that we can be reasonable and logical and not get more into cancel culture than we need to. But the smaller of those 2, go ahead and put right back in the place where you got it. The one that you wrap up, this can be the piece that the parents hide for the kids to find just before the meal. And then the kids will once they find it, they'll bring it back to you and you have to redeem it. You have to bargain for it. Now, it's typically you don't want to handle money on Shabbat. And it's when kids are little is a good time to teach them that lesson. So instead of, shelling out a $20 bill to redeem your afikomen, make your agreement, shake hands on your agreement, whatever you bargain for. If it's a new bicycle, I'm sorry for you. But some kids drive a hard bargain. And whatever it is, just you're making your agreement, but you don't have to deliver the money on Shabbat. You don't have to deliver the bike that day. You're just agreeing that I will pay this price to redeem the afikomen. And a custom that they have in some places in the Middle East is for like the leader who's going to have this piece of afikomen, wrap it up and then have it in a little bag that I used one of those little nylon backpacks this year. They're real lightweight. They would wrap it up and then they would tie it on one of the youngest kids. Now the kid needs to be big enough to defend himself. Sometimes kids get out of hand on Passover. But what that will do is if he will agree to take charge of that piece of afikomen, he knows that that piece of afikomen, it has to be redeemed, so it's worth something. And the other kids are going to be trying to get that piece of afikomen away from him too, because they could potentially have two pieces of afikomen to redeem. And what does this do? Pick the kid, if you can, that you think is most likely to fall asleep. That was kind of the point of tying it on to the younger kids. They tend to fall asleep faster. And so now he has to guard this afikomen because he doesn't want to lose that extra, redemption value of the afikomen. And so he'll stay awake, and then the other kids will mess with him, trying to steal his afikomen. And like I said, you have to kind of keep an eye on that one. It can get pretty hilarious depending on the kids. But it's also fun because then if he can keep possession of it, then he's got an extra piece there that he can redeem. Or if one of the kids can get it away from him, like if he falls slap asleep on the table, then one of the other kids can have an extra piece to redeem, which is this right here. Another custom, again, this goes back to the Middle East, where, often what you'll find in the Middle East is remnants of customs that were probably more in use in Judea in the time of Yeshua. You're getting closer to the source, and you're staying closer culturally to the realities there. The farther away you get away culturally, like say Europe, the more likely those customs are to have undergone a transformation just based on where they were. And of course, putting it in a bundle on this kid's back. Remember, this is what the Torah says, how they wrapped up their kneading bowls, the dough in their kneading bowls, and they carried it out. And so that's what it represents. And that's a good teaching opportunity when if you're using a backpack or whatever it is that you're using, you can always tell the kids, this is what it was like when they left Egypt. They had to put their kneading bowls on their backs to take their unleavened bread with them. Another custom is for everybody to take a piece of matzah at this point and just very briefly put it on your shoulder, right? If you're not doing the thing like putting it on the kid's back, then everybody at the table can pick up a piece of matzah and just briefly put it on your shoulder and tell the kids, remember, they had to take the dough out of Egypt in kneading bowls. Another custom, again, that comes from the Middle East is there they typically had soft matzah. And so you're going to have a piece of soft afikomen. And the leader would take that soft matzah and tear it into the shapes of Hebrew letters. One letter would be the Dalet, which means a door. And the other letter that he would tear out would be the Vav, which means a nail or a connector, right? There is some symbolism there. And I don't know that I want to go over it right now, but In fact, I think I might have put it into something for us to do when we get back on our footsteps. But the symbolism briefly of the dial at the door, and actually maybe I put it in here. Maybe I just put it closer to whether Elijah shows up or not. But again, there's some more apocalyptic symbolism here, because in the original Passover, they had to stay behind the door in order for the death angel to pass over to see the blood in the Passover. In temple times, it would have been more like tailgating, modern tailgating, because not everybody's going to have a house to go into. So, they probably had their favorite places they went every year, maybe, people that they knew in Jerusalem, probably in family groups and extended family groups. But it would have been very much as much an outdoor experience as an indoor in temple times, because remember, you've got this roasting of the lamb, then you've got to divvy it up among around 50 people. So those 50 people are going to be camping or lodging very close to one another, and very close to where probably the barbecue, the roasting would have taken place. And of course, the women are going to be preparing meals to go with it as well. But the door had that significance there at the first Exodus. And the door, what's on the other side of door is destruction. What's on the inside of the door is going to be salvation. So there's just, a brief bit of symbolism there. And of course, the Vav, we can very easily connect that with Yeshua. Yeshua said, I am the door. And through this death, through sacrificing his life, he became the door by allowing himself to be nailed to the tree. He became our sacrifice. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it's knowing that custom. If you did have soft afikomen, you might want to try that sometime, especially after we get into more of the explanation of it. And again, we would relate the afikomen, because you're hiding it. It's wrapped in the linen napkin. Be sure to take the opportunity here to talk about the hidden manna. That's very important, because that is one of the rewards that's offered in the message to the 7 assemblies is, if you will overcome, I will give you from the hidden manna. And we've discussed, the different symbolisms, like the manna in the Ark of the Covenant, representing not just the miracles of the wilderness, but also representing their relationship to the commandments themselves. We talked about how in the process of grinding the manna, that it would miraculously double on a Rev Shabbat. After they picked on Friday morning, that miraculously in the process, it was understood like a miracle. It would double, even though it was only an omer when they picked it up, it would have 2 omers worth of yield. So that's a type of the hidden manna. Yeshua being the hidden manna, the one who was hidden away in a grave, but yet he was the word from heaven. He was the bread from heaven. So yeah, that's one you definitely, if you have the teaching time, do that. And it's okay if you want to have additional seders during the Passover week. It's fine. It says you shall eat it for 7 days with maror. It's okay. You're not eating the lamb for 7 days. No, you eat that up before midnight. But in terms of commemorating and being able to tell the story over and over, it's perfectly fine to do that. If you wanted to have a Seder every night for 7 days, you could. It would just, the symbolism of the lamb would only apply to the first night. But it's fine, because you're going to keep eating matzah anyway. And that's why you see in some Jewish calendars, it'll say second Seder. Some communities will have a meal of Messiah at the end of it. But you can continue to do teaching seders. And if you find yourself, if you've been in this long enough, and you know how cumbersome it can be to explain the symbolism of Yeshua to newcomers, and you would just like to go at a normal pace sometimes, don't feel bad if you say, hey, my family and I are going to have our Seder at the appointed time, but the next night I'm going to invite some Christian friends over who are curious, and that way I can go really slow. I can leave some things out that I know they can't swallow, and at every step I can show them Messiah. I can distill it for them. Don't feel bad about doing that's problem solving. That's just being very wise, so that you're not trying to cram too much down somebody's throat who can't swallow that yet. But you're not putting people to sleep because they're like, my goodness, how many times are you going to tell us about the hidden manna? We already know about the hidden manna. You have to know your audience sometimes. Okay, the Magid is going to be the telling. And so you're going to take that other piece of the broken matzah, and this is where the commandment to tell the story, we have to remember the commandment is to everybody. There's going to be certain parts of the Seder that the leader can just read it. But there's going to be certain things that you want everybody reading it together, because that's the only way you fulfill the commandment, because where it says, you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of what the Lord did to me am I going out from Egypt. You have to do that. You have to tell the story. You're not exempt from telling the story. And so that's why when you get down to the Magid, you're going to be doing a lot of things in unison. And by the time you get done with the Hallel, I mean, you might actually be hoarse. You might not be used to talking that much. But at the Magid, this is kind of the getting into fulfilling the most literal of these commandments, such as telling your children on that day. And remember what we said about Ephesus. It means permitted. And Ephesus is the first feast mentioned of the seven. Most people call them the seven churches of Revelation. They actually are the seven Moedim, because each is thematic to one of those seven feasts. Ephesus corresponds to Pesach. And so as you're reading the Magid, you say, this is the bread of affliction. And this is important too, where it's calling it the bread of affliction. If you can read the Hebrew on the other side, halachma aniyah, maybe underline that if you can, or even if you got a highlighter, highlight it. Because later, as we get to I found some spectacular things about Laodicea, the seventh, and what was said to them as we compare it to Passover. Like we're looking at the two ends, basically, this is Passover and this is Sukkot, this is Ephesus and this is Laodicea. Going to be some interesting things that are said to Laodicea that we know started over here at Passover. One of those things that we know starts over here at Passover is we talk about every year halachma aniyah, which is the bread of the poor. Aniyah, that's the poor. It's also translated as the bread of affliction because poor people are afflicted. To be poor is an affliction, right? So it means both, poor and afflicted. So it's the bread of the poor. Well, when you get over here to Laodicea, part of the message that he sends to them is that you believe you're wealthy. You think you're rich. You think you have need of nothing, but actually you're poor. Why are they poor? Because they didn't eat the bread of affliction. They didn't eat the bread of the poor. They didn't want to be poor. And that's the message throughout the ages is we want all the blessings of the kingdom, but we don't want the afflictions that go with it. We want to do the miracles for Yeshua, but we don't necessarily want to know him and the fellowship of his suffering. We have to start out the journey that way with the understanding, if we don't eat the bread of the poor, we will not be humble enough to enter into the kingdom, because he will not abide with an arrogant person. So part of Pesach right here is we start this journey in humility. So we start it with halachma anya. So when we eat that bread, that, honestly, I think any of us can handle it for a week. If we had to eat it for 40 years, I'm not sure we'd be that happy with it. But it goes back to your attitude. They said the manna, the taste of the manna was dependent upon the person. If you weren't a complainer, the manna could taste like anything you wanted it to taste like. But if you were bitter, if you were a complainer, if you were a person who was resisting the affliction, then it would have a bitter taste to you. You wouldn't like it. Like, there's nothing here but this manna. Well, the problem is not really with the manna. It's the problem with the person eating it. So we have to think about this at this step in the Seder. Some year, there's going to be a Passover where it's going to be the last one we celebrate in this earthly body. That's just the way it is, unless we expire before Yeshua returns. If we are alive and remain when he comes, 1 year will be our last Passover that we celebrate in a corruptible body. So the last thing we want to do at our last Passover in a corruptible body is complain about the bread. We don't want to be complainers. And so this reminds us to stay humble in the walk, even as we're being tried and tested and afflicted. So we would say together, this is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is needy, let him come and celebrate Pesach. Now we are here. Next year, may we be in the land of Israel. Now we are slaves. Next year, may we be free men. May we be permitted. And remember what Ephesus means. It means permitted. Remember the significance of Ephesus in the first century. It was the slave capital of the world. And so when we say now we are slaves, that has a special significance to the people of Ephesus. That's what they're known for. But next year, may we be free men, may we be permitted. So it goes even beyond what we know about Pharaoh not wanting to permit the Israelites to leave Egypt. It transcends all the way forward into the assembly of Ephesus, because the world's not going to want to let us leave. They won't have a choice, though. So one Passover, if we're still alive, we will say this. I don't know, maybe we'll say it in the garden too. If our souls are collected there, maybe we'll be doing the same thing there. We say, now we're slaves. Next year, may we be free men. Next year, may we be permitted. May we be released. And at this point, you would pour the second cup of wine. And there's some customs here, like taking the Seder plate away momentarily, that I don't think is all that important at this point, whether you do that or whether you don't. But this is the point where it's very important, again, because we're continuing to tell the story. And so we're going to have the 4 questions, and you're going to have, it might be 4 different kids, it might be the same kid. Just depends on how you want to do it. But they're going to ask these 4 questions. And the questions are designed to provoke the answer that is fulfilling the commandment of telling your children on that day. On all other nights, we may eat chametz and matzah, but on this night, only matzah. And this is called manish tanah. Why is this different? Or why is this changed? On all other nights, we may eat vegetables, but on this night, we eat maror. We're eating something bitter. We don't normally do that. Okay, remember the maror has to do with Smyrna. You've got Ephesus, which means permitted, and then it's followed with Smyrna, which is the root of that is again going to go back to maror, or the bitter herbs. The third question, on all other nights, we do not dip even once, but on this night, twice, because that's what you're going to do. You're going to be dipping into that maror. On all other nights, we eat either sitting or reclining, but on this night, we all recline, because we went over that last week. You know, you recline because it symbolizes that you are free now. All right. And at this point, if you're following the, taking the Seder plate off the table, you would put the Seder plate back on the table at this point. And this is where it's really important to say this part in unison. Right? We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, but Hashem, our God, took us out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Right there is prophecy. The mighty hand has already occurred. It was the exodus from Egypt. The outstretched arm has yet to occur. So this is prophecy. When he brings us out in the greater exodus, that's the outstretched arm. It's already been done, but it hasn't been done. Had not the Holy One, blessed is he, taken our fathers out from Egypt, then we, our children, and our children's children would have remained subservient to Pharaoh in Egypt. Even if we were all men of wisdom, understanding, experience, and knowledge of the Torah, it would still be an obligation upon us to tell about the exodus from Egypt. The more one tells about the discussion of the exodus, the more he is praiseworthy. And that's why we say you can do this 7 straight nights if you want to. Keep discussing it. If you'll notice the longer passages, thematic passages of the Torah, Passover is a big deal. It just keeps going. Whether you're talking about the exodus from Egypt, or whether you're talking about the Pesach offerings and how you should do the Pesach once the temple is built, it's extensive. It's really not something you can do in a few hours. And here's what happened. And this is a part, again, that some people are like, why is this even in here? I'm going to explain to you why, but you actually know why. It was in one of your lessons, maybe 2 of our lessons. It says, it happened that Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, which should ring a bell, and Rabbi Tarfon were gathered at the Seder in Bnei Brak. They discussed the exodus from Egypt all that night until their students came and said to them, our teachers, the time has come for the reading of the morning Shema. Now, not too far back, we talked about the timing of the watches of the night. And so if the students have come to their teachers and said it's time for the reading of the morning Shema, at this point, you know that the clock has ticked over far enough that whatever commandment was going to be fulfilled in that previous day, especially as it pertains to the saying of the Shema, your evening Shema, at that point, it's too late to say your evening Shema if you missed it. And we discussed that because we were talking about the watches of the night and why it's like the return seems to always be connected to the watches of the night. And so if their students come and they say it's time for the reading of the morning Shema, then what has been done at that point, or what you intended to do, it has to have already been done. And that's why the emphasis is upon finishing before midnight. Finishing the lamb before midnight, finishing the Seder before midnight. And as you get back into the very back, you'll see that repetition of about midnight, because again, it's prophetic. It's reiterating. And I think that's why you hear it so much, even as you get into the Gospels, the warning that he's going to come like a thief in the night. Had the master of the house known at what hour he was going to come, he would have secured his goods. And so Rabbi Akiva, the one I said should ring a bell, remember, Rabbi Akiva was the one who got the Messiah wrong. That's important. Like I say, this is a passage that you as a grown-up might understand it. The kids won't understand it. Little kids will not understand it. But I'm going to tell you why it's important. Rabbi Akiva misidentified Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. And because he was so well respected, millions followed him. Millions believed him when he said Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. And we talked about the massacres that occurred because of this. That was an incredible pressure on him to know that. And remember, the way that he was killed was the Romans took combs and they stripped the skin from his body while he was alive. And he was the one who died with the Shema on his lips. And his students said, "Even now, Rabbi?" And he's like, "Even now." I can only imagine how much heaviness was on him because, number one, he knows he's responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people. He knows there's going to be an exile as a result of this. He knows that times will only get harder because of this. And then he knows he just misidentified the Messiah. Think of all that weight on him as he's dying. Plus, they're stripping his skin off of him while he's alive. And so the last words on his lips were the Shema as he died. And why did he die? Because they were caught studying the Torah, talking about the Torah, teaching the Torah. The Romans had made it against the law to do that. And so he became a martyr. And that's very much a part of the book of Revelation, except the problem here now is he's being martyred for the wrong Messiah. Not necessarily for that Messiah, because, I don't know that there was much connection with the Romans and him telling people that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. Their objection was he was still teaching Torah against the law. And so Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, "I'm like a 70-year-old man, but I could not succeed in having the Exodus from Egypt mentioned every night until Ben Zoma expounded it. In order that you may remember the day you left Egypt, all the days of your life." The phrase, the days of your life, would have indicated only the days. But the addition of the word all includes the nights as well. But the sages declare that the days of your life would mean only the present world. The addition of all includes the era of Messiah. So they're having a messianic discussion right here. And so what they're saying about observing this Passover and telling this story, doing the Magid, the importance of it is that you may remember the day you left Egypt, all the days of your life forever and ever and ever and ever through eternity. In other words, this is an event. This understanding of how you left Egypt. You say, "Well, I didn't leave that Egypt." Yes, you did. You did, and you will. There's an Exodus. There's a greater Exodus. Whether you were delivered with the mighty hand or whether you will be delivered with an outstretched arm, nevertheless, Yeshua has delivered you, and he will deliver you all the days of your life. And if you are resurrected, that life will never end. That's the point of them telling this little story here. All the days of your life. It includes the 1,000-year reign. That you're going to remember that during his 1,000-year reign. You're going to remember every day of that and beyond into the Olam Haba. And so knowing that the implication of reading this little passage about the rabbis, whether you do or whether you don't, I think you should understand it. You should understand that it's telling you could be martyred for keeping this word. That's why Rabbi Akiva is included in here. You could be keeping the Passover like these guys were doing. And if it's exposed, there might come a time in tribulation where you would be martyred for keeping the Passover. There might be a time when you're martyred for keeping the word. That's why the kids don't need to know that. I know we've got visions right now of Romans stripping our skin with combs, but that's a heavy thing, but it's still part of the Passover. The halachma anya, I did go over that. It has to do again with, remember how we said there was a 3-day preparation period for receiving the Torah at Sinai? Well, if we back all the way up to the Passover, this is Moses' repeated request of Pharaoh, let us go 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Otherwise, he will fall upon us with pestilence or with sword. He will fall upon us. See the language there? You don't expect him to say that. You expect him to say, Pharaoh, he'll fall on you with pestilence or sword, which he did. But instead, at this preliminary stage, Moshe is saying, hey, if we don't go out and celebrate this feast in the wilderness, then we're the ones who are going to be struck with pestilence or sword. We have to obey the word or we'll pay a price. But the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you draw the people away from their work? Get back to your labors. Let the labor be heavier on the men and let them work at it so that they will pay no attention to false words. Right? So the emphasis here is Pharaoh is flipping around what is true and what is false. The truth is, if they don't go out into the wilderness, if they don't obey the word that they've been given, a pestilence and sword could fall upon them. He says, get back to your labors. Well, what do we have? Is it, I think it's Thyatira, labor of affliction. Get back to your labors, labor of affliction. So there's a connection here with the language, but he's saying, go back to work. And this is what the world will tell us. If we're trying to say, I need off for Shabbat, the world will say, get back to your labors. If we say, I need off for Passover, the world will say, get back to your labors. These are just false words. You shouldn't pay any attention to the words of the Most High. You should pay attention to my words. But the pestilence and the sword, as we look at the book of Revelation, there will be those who are lukewarm, who they have a belief in Yeshua. They know what the word is. It's available to them, but they have chosen to disregard it. And if you choose to disregard it, then there is all manner of pestilence and sword that will be falling upon you. And you can see that very vividly with the release of the 4 horses, where you can see the red horse going out with the sword, where you can see the black horse, and then the white horse, it's actually a kind of a yellowish green horse, chloros, going out with pestilence. And one just kind of pulls the other, is the way that goes. Let's see. Anything I want to add to that? We can also see this struggle right here. It refers to Pharaoh as the king of Egypt in this case, very specifically as the king of Egypt. And as we get over to Pergamum, which aligns with the days of unleavened bread, kind of counting forward from the Passover and seeing the events of this week. As we look at Pergamum, there is the third congregation. What was warned to Pergamum is that they're having to deal with the place where Satan's throne is. They're trying to prevail because there's a struggle between Pharaoh's throne and the throne of the Most High in the Exodus. But in Pergamum, again, it's the throne that where we see Yeshua seated at the right hand of the Father. But Satan's throne, again, is going to be in conflict with the throne of the Most High again. And that's what he says to them. He says, I know your deeds and your toil and your perseverance, and that you cannot tolerate evil men, and you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not. And you found them to be false. And you have perseverance and have endured for my name's sake and have not grown weary. Well, the deeds, the toil, and the perseverance, yes, we very much associate that with the Exodus from Egypt and how they cried out. I mean, he didn't answer them. He didn't send Moses and Aaron until they cried out because of the evil men. And that's what we have to do. We have to cry out when we see evil around us. He says, you put to the test those who call themselves apostles or sent ones, and they're not. You found them to be false. What does Pharaoh do? He calls in his magicians. And it looks like they're duplicating the same miracles, but they're not. They are illusions. It's sorcery. It's false. And eventually the magicians have to admit, this is the finger of Elohim. We can't do this. And so he said, you have perseverance. You've endured for my name's sake. You've not grown weary. So that's a key there as we're looking at those first three assemblies of Revelation, that this is the process that Adonai says that they're going through. The very same one that they went through in Egypt. So with Ephesus here, he's attaching this toil and perseverance at Ephesus with the Passover. He's saying, yeah, there's going to be people who are going to tell you my words are false. There are going to be people who tell you my miracles are false, but you have to test them. And he says, you endured, you just kept going. The Israelites could have just said, no, we're not going to go forward from here. It's just getting too hard, and they didn't. They persevered. They threatened. Also, it talks about the days of Antipas. If we skip from Ephesus down to Pergamum, in other words, if we go from Passover to the first fruits of the barley, which is what Pergamum would represent, it says, to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, the one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast my name, and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. Right. Antipas, it means in place of the Father. Right. In this case, there's a person named Antipas who is a faithful witness, but using the name Antipas there, it makes you think of, again, what we just read about Rabbi Akiva. And I'm having this conversation here where he credits the wrong person with being the Messiah. He puts him in the place of Yeshua. And so you have to know, he tells us about Antipas, my witness, my faithful one who was killed. Yeshua was the faithful one who was killed. We don't know who this particular person was. It's his name that's important. But the days of Antipas in place of the Father, well, the whole point of telling in the Magid is so that your children can take the place of the Father in their generation. That's part of the commandment, to inculcate this teaching and this history, this remembrance into your children, So the father-son dialogue, or the parent-child dialogue, it doesn't mean you don't tell your daughters, you do. But when you see a plural, it's going to be in the masculine. If you tell your son in that day. All right. So using antipas is emphasizing, I believe, the importance of passing on this message to the children, because the children will take the place of their fathers in their generations. They will then have to, in turn, tell the story. So there's 4 sons here. There's a wise one, a wicked one, a simple one, and one who is unable to ask. The wise son, what does he say? What are the testimonies, decrees, and ordinances which Hashem our God has commanded you? Therefore explain to him the laws of the Passover offering, that one may not eat dessert after the final taste of the Passover offering. So he said, tell me how to do it. Just real quick, let's go through the 4 sons. You got the wise son, and he's going to ask you specifics because he is wise. In fact, I'll stop staring right there. The wicked son, what does he say? Of what purpose is this work to you? He says to you, excluding himself. By excluding himself from the community of believers, he denies the basic principles. Therefore, blunt his teeth and tell him it was because of this that Hashem did so for me when I went out of Egypt. For me, but not for him. Had he been there, he would not have been redeemed. Now, that sounds harsh. But just remember, with these 4 sons, they're not saying that every human being is going to fit in one box for all time. We might start out as the simple son. We might start out as the son who is unable to ask. We might go through a rebellious spell and be the wicked son. But then we might be redeemed and be the wise son. And so at any given time, you could be one of these 4. And you might find that you're all of them in one day some days. We can have days like that. But it's to show you different approaches. And you can see this if you look at the people who ask you questions about the way that you're walking. Some people are curious. They're genuinely curious. And they say, well, explain this thing to me. Some people are completely disengaged. What does it mean to you? But not to me. It's just what you do, but it's not what I do. They exclude yourself from you on purpose. They create a distance between you on purpose. Don't be offended by that. Some people who have been the worst wicked sons have ended up becoming the most passionate of believers. Sometimes we act like the wicked son when we're scared. When we're scared, we might make a mistake. The simple son, what does he say? What is this? He doesn't really know how to make a good question. You know, the farther we walk as believers, the better our questions should be. And it doesn't mean if somebody asks a simple question that you think they should have mastered by now, that you just kind of snicker at them like, you don't know that? Well, Yeshua did that, didn't he? But he could. He was the living word. If he wanted to say, you're a teacher in Israel and you don't know that, he could. But we can't do that. We have to be kind. And so when people ask a simple question, we come back with something on their learning level. We don't talk down to them. We don't talk above them. Say, with a strong hand did Hashem take us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. And so you can see right here that you're making it personal. Very similar to the son who's unable to ask. You have to initiate the subject for him because he doesn't even know what to say. You shall tell your son on that day, it's because of this that Hashem did so for me when I went out of Egypt. It's just like reading a story, a bedtime story to your kids. You read them the story because you want them to learn the lesson in the story. be kind to your neighbors. Don't eat other people's porridge, whatever the story is. Because you as the adult are having to even guide them into those places. And so he might go to the place, okay, what is this? Now they're asking questions. Now there's some curiosity here, but not enough to really form a specific question. Again, you're making it personal. With a strong hand did Hashem take us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. Okay, you can't just stop there. He's going to say, what are you talking about? You see how that's kind of a technique? It's not even kind of, it is. That's a technique. You drop just enough information, he'll ask another question. Or he'll say, tell me the story about how you came out of bondage. What bondage were you in? And it's enticing the child to engage with you. Maybe he's not mature enough to ask the same questions as the wise son. But you're bringing this child along at their learning level. Again, not talking above them, not talking below them, but letting them ask you questions. See, it's just a simple sentence. With a strong hand did Hashem take us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. No kid's going to let that just lie there. And so when dealing with adults, you can use the same approach. The one who just is flabbergasted with why you're keeping a Passover, and maybe you're not even Jewish, and they're just shaking their heads, you can make it personal, like a testimony. Let me tell you how I got saved. Let me tell you how he brought me out of Egypt. Give them a personal testimony. But see, with the simple son, well, what is this? All right, use the opportunity to go into we. You see, personal testimony with the son who doesn't know how to ask. Now the simple son, what is this? Now it becomes we. What are we trying to do? We're trying to move them eventually to the wise son. Because now that you're part of the community of believers, we're going to give you everything that the community of believers knows. But with the simple son, you're taking it from my personal testimony to now our testimony as a people. Do you see how he's stepping up with each of the questions? And that's a great template for us to use, not just for kids at a Passover Seder. And it continues, which we'll continue tomorrow. But during these passages, especially called that compose the Magid, it's very important that we all say it out loud together. Because this is, there's things in here that are custom, there's things in here that are tradition, but telling the story is not custom or tradition. Telling the story is literally fulfilling the commandment. And so if you're leading a Passover Seder, even if, you were to portion things out, people really should be kind of at least mouthing along, telling the story. Okay, so remember the breakdown of the word for frog is going to go back to tzipor, which is bird, and dea, which is knowledge. So a frog is seen as a bird of knowledge. Okay, and so this is the detailed destruction. The detailed destruction that the rabbis were talking about concerning the plague of the frogs. Right, so they were having this discussion in a secret attic Seder. They were hiding from the Romans in order to do their Passover Seder. And that's why I say when the adults read this section, you should have a sense of like this impending doom. I could be keeping the Passover. There could be people looking for me because I'm obeying the word. So they're debating how the plague of frogs occurred. And this is all the opinions that they were, pushing out there that it was this way, and then it was this way, or that was this way. But part of this, it might seem like we're doing exactly what we want to avoid, which is debating insignificant details to the point that we're like, well, where's the spirit of the Torah? Why were they having this detailed debate? Weren't they kind of losing the Torah study right in the middle of this? Not really. Because Rabbi Azariah, that we just saw the little blip on here, he actually rebuked Rabbi Akiva for trying to even understand the frog plague and the frogs. But his explanation of how the frogs happened is that it was in contrast to what Rabbi Akiva said. He was saying one frog bred so rapidly that it filled Egypt. And then Ben Azariah said at first it was only one frog, but it croaked, it whistled to the others, and they came. Now, if you can see the subtext here, now that you know the story of Rabbi Akiva misidentifying Bar Kokhba as the Messiah, you see what they're talking about here. It's telling you what happened and why they rebuked Rabbi Akiva. Basically, like Ben Azariah said, Rabbi Akiva croaked, Rabbi Akiva whistled to the others, and they also came and believed in a false Messiah. So that's sobering as you read through there. And of course, that's the summary of how he died, with the Shema on his lips, because he wanted his last word to be echad from the Shema. And I suspect it's because of all these things that were on his mind, these great mistakes that he made.